want to welcome everybody to this panel discussion. This is sponsored by U.S. Friends of the Soviet People, National Office. We have here people who are from other chapters in other areas, but it's being sponsored by the National Office. The issue that we're going to be talking about this evening is an issue that is really dire for many of us. Many of us who have relatives, family members who went through World War II, the Great Patriotic War in Russia and the Soviet Union, and in this country there was an anti-fascist alliance of England, France, United States, and the Soviet Union. It was a traumatic experience. Many of us lost family members in that struggle against fascism. There were people here whose countries were invaded by fascism. Some of my friends just came in from Greece. They were invaded by Nazi Germany. I think we should close the door. And so therefore, what many of us see as the resurgence of a fascist movement in Europe, not only in France, in England, and in Germany, but also in the Ukraine and in former sections of the Soviet Union, where for generations you had Russians and Ukrainians intermarry for generations, and there was no problems. Now we see a situation where the younger generation, mainly from what we see from the TV, who never experienced World War II, seem to be following a path to rewrite history and take the issues of the people who fought against the invasion by the fascists. These people are now viewed as enemies, and history is being rewritten. That the people who fought with the Germans when they came in the Ukraine, the Bandera people, are now viewed by the new government in Kiev as the patriots. So we call this forum together, this panel, at the Left Forum, in order to try to shed some light on this and for people to ask questions. I'm going to let them introduce themselves. Our two speakers so far is Professor Barry Latucci, and Martin. He's going to talk about who he is and where he comes from, and Martin Solo from Buffalo, the branch in Buffalo. Okay, thank you. Barry, you're covering.
Thanks, Angelo. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Good to see you. My name is Barry Latucci. I teach history at Gervers College in Brooklyn and part of City University of New York. My presentation today is to give an overview of the history of fascism in the Ukraine and to show that it is now very much an indigenous movement, part of a long history in the Ukraine, sponsored both by German imperialism and American imperialism for their own purposes, but actually the history is even broader than that. And I think one of the things that is really, that I'm going to really try to bring out is the fact that the United States has done a terrific job from the point of view of the CIA and U.S. history, or U.S. imperialism, from the imperialist point of view, of promoting fascism and keeping it alive and allowing it to reestablish itself in the 21st century in the Ukraine. I would say that U.S. promotion of fascism has been more successful even than German Nazi imperialism was. Well, let me start at the beginning. In the beginning, Ukrainians and Russians were one people, united by a common language, a common religion, a common state, a common culture, common territory, and a common history. The first Russian state, as many of you know, was Kievan Rus, established in 860 in the Common Era, lasting until the 1240s. During this time, there was no distinction between Ukrainians and Russians. as there should not be today. Kievan Rus territories extended from the western Carpathian Mountains, which today are a border between the Ukraine and Slovakia, Hungary, and Romania, all the way east to the Volga River. That was Kievan Rus. This population converted as one people to the Greek Orthodox Christianity in 988 under their ruler, Prince Vladimir, who himself converted in Crimea, a church very sacred to both Russians and Ukrainians, still marks that very spot to this day. The territories which today are most often associated with extreme Ukrainian nationalism and anti-Russian sentiment, particularly the territory known as Galicia in northwestern Ukraine, and also northern Bukovina, which is just to the south, both in the Carpathians, do not have actually this long anti-Russian history or sentiment, as is often claimed. These territories were founded and settled by Russians. And even the famously anti-Russian city of Lviv or Lvov, depending if you're Ukrainian or Russian, was founded by Kievan Rus rulers in the early 1200s. Ukrainian and Russians are one people, and we can go back as far as Herodotus' time, if you wish, 2,500 years ago, and Herodotus himself lived among and wrote among the people in that time. So the origins of the divisions between Ukrainians and Russians begins with the Mongol conquest in the 1200s, and then really takes root in the 1300s when Galicia is conquered by Lithuania. And actually Lithuania conquered more than Galicia. It conquered the territory somewhat to the east and north, Volhynia, and to the south all of Bukovina, and even further south into central and southern Ukraine. By 1444, though, the Lithuanian monarchy had been taken over by the Polish monarchy because of intermarriage, and Polish kings ruled Galicia until 1772. But it was the Polish land-owning aristocracy that changed things for the Ukrainian population there. They imposed a very brutal form of serfdom, particularly in terms of the use of the corvée, kind of chain gang slave labor. And they also imposed a cultural religious persecution or oppression. The serfdom, so I'll get into that in a moment. Many Ukrainian peasants did flee from this, and they went to the forests or the steppes and joined small societies of free armed men called Cossacks. Cossack is a Turkish word meaning free man. And like in a lot of Slavic languages, there are a lot of Turkish words. Cossacks existed, of course, both in the Ukraine and Russia. The Polish nobility, in order to tighten their control over the Ukrainian peasantry, created a new church. And this is a very important historical event relating to, later on, to Ukrainian fascism. This church was called the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, or the Uniate Church. Well, what it unified really was the Ukrainian peasantry with the papacy, as well as with the Polish nobility. This church was established at the infamous Council of Brest in 1596. By forcing conversion to this new church under Catholic control, both the Catholic Church and the Polish nobility extended their control over the Ukrainian population. But this forced conversion, I think, should be seen as a kind of genocide over a once unified people. This religious division is to this day mostly established in Galicia. That's where the Uniate Church is strongest. But in this way, Poland and the Roman Catholic Church were able to tear away a part of the Ukrainian people and a piece of territory from the Ukrainian people, really forever. After 300 years, this church does become deeply entrenched in Galicia and Bukovina. And I want to stress that CIA documents, which now have been declassified regarding Ukrainian, and I mean there's extensive documents, a lot of them don't have a lot of information, but I think one thing that comes out, if you read them, and you should read them, is that almost so many of them repeat over and over again that those most likely to support Ukrainian nationalist movements or Ukrainian fascism were Uniats, members of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. It's not as true today as it was, say, 30, 40 years ago, but for the 20th century it was very true. In the 1660s, there were massive uprisings, though, by some Ukrainians in central Ukraine and eastern Ukraine against the Polish nobility. These were led by Cossacks and their hetman leaders, and these territories actually fought to rejoin Russia and did so, ultimately leaving just that northwestern portion in Poland, the Galicia-Bukovina region. That's why that remained Uniate to this day. But ironically, this is hailed today by Ukrainian nationalist historians as a great moment in Ukrainian history, which it is, even though it provides, it is a precedent for what's going on in eastern Ukraine today. A group of Ukrainians who do not want to be part of this colonialism, which then was in Poland, today of the United States and the West. Poland was finally partitioned and swallowed up by Prussia, Russia, and Austria in the late 1700s. And during the first partition in 1772, Galicia and Bukovina were taken over by Austria, the Austrian Empire. So from 1772 to 1919, Galicia and Bukovina are part of the Austrian Empire, later Austro-Hungarian Empire. Austria's ruling Habsburg monarchy were the chief protectors of the Roman Catholic Church and the first practitioners of what became known as the German imperialist idea of Lebensraum. The Austrians relaxed the serfdom in Galicia and Bukovina, and in 1848, thanks to the revolutions of that year, completely abolished serfdom. But they increased the pressure on the Ukrainian population through religious persecution. Thousands of Jesuits were sent into these territories and even beyond the Ukrainian territories into the Russian Empire with the goal of subverting the Orthodox Church and converting people to the Uniate Church. So we can see here the beginnings of German imperialism in Galicia and beyond. In effect, the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church served as a springboard for what became known as Drang nach Osten, or Germany's drive to the east. And this was a Habsburg policy before it was a Bismarckian policy or a Hitlerian policy. So Galicia was this beachhead for Austro-German expansionism to the east, and the Uniate Church was the vehicle. By the way, the Habsburgs followed a similar policy in the Balkans, as the Uniate Church converted Orthodox Serbs in the southern Austrian territories and expanded Croatia step by step by subsuming Orthodox populations under Roman Catholic Church and Austro-German control. Over the course of this long foreign occupation from the 1300s until World War I, Catholic rulers solidified their rule and their cultural influence. They preached hatred of Russians and of Russian Orthodoxy and of Jews and of Judaism. This is the origin of Ukrainian fascism, instigated by German imperialism, but it does take a life of its own. The first great leader of Ukrainian nationalism in modern times was, not surprisingly, a Ukrainian Greek Catholic or Uniate cleric from Galicia, Semyon Petlur. He tried to, in the 1890s, he tried, like the Jesuits before him, they tried to infiltrate Russian Orthodox seminaries in order to subvert it. He was eventually expelled and revealed, and and he joined an organization called the Revolutionary Ukrainian Party, which became his main vehicle for promoting extreme Ukrainian nationalism. Prior to 1914, though, he was just known as an ultra-nationalist journalist. But the Russian Revolution thrust him into power. He became the military leader of the self-proclaimed Ukrainian Republic, which was declared in November of 1917. And he even designed the Ukrainian flag, which is still the Ukrainian flag to this day. He proclaimed Ukrainian as the only official language in the Ukraine, banning all others. Exactly what the government that came to power after 2014 did recently. And like today's Ukrainian nationalists, he condemned all, quote, foreign elements in the Ukraine, meaning Jews, Russians, and Poles. But in Galicia, in particular, Poles and Jews actually made up the majority of the population, oddly enough. There were 2 million Jews, and there were 2 million Jews in the Ukraine, not to mention millions of Russians as well. So what to do? As military leader of the Ukrainian Republic, Petlura organized 1,200 pogroms from 1917 to 1920, killing 200,000 Jews in this period alone. And when the Russian and Jewish workers in Kiev rose up in revolt around the famous Arsenal factory, he murdered them, calling them foreign invaders. Petlura, so this is the background of today's Ukrainian nationalism. These are the precedents and the heroes of their movement today. Petlura personally led a pogrom in my grandfather's town of Zhashkova in central Ukraine. Most of my grandfather's family, most of my family survived. 2 were shot, but most survived because we were able to purchase our lives. Jews without money were marched to the synagogue and burned alive. And this story was recounted to me by my grandfather's sister 33 years ago. So you're lucky just to get robbed by Petlura. The Germans occupied the Ukraine briefly in 1918 and saw the possibility of using the Ukrainian regime for their own expansionist aspirations, but they lost the war and they had to retreat. The Soviets came back. Petlura's armies retreated into Poland. They made a deal with Pilsudski's government in Poland, and in the Polish-Soviet War of 1920, Pilsudski's armies managed to retake a good portion of the western Ukraine. But they ended up just stabbing the Ukrainians in the back, and Petlura's men were all arrested and sent to internment camps in 1920-21. Petlura himself ran away to Paris, where he got his what was coming to him from a Jewish survivor from one of the pogroms who killed him in revenge for the murder of his parents. Thousands of Western Ukrainians who had fought with Petlura were imprisoned in Poland, and they remained well organized. It's ironic that thanks to their imprisonment, Petlura's men were able to organize themselves, and shortly after Petlura's assassination, the future fascist Ukrainian organization came out of these internment camps, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, or OUN. The OUN, or Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, would be the political organization of Ukrainian fascism during World War II. It's known for having 2 branches, one led by a man named Melnik, the other by the infamous Stefan Bandera, who is today hailed as one of the great heroes of Ukrainian nationalism. What was the difference between these 2 factions? Not actually Bandera was really the man in charge, was the leader. But the main difference was that Melnik and his faction were fine with the Nazis making all the decisions, including decisions about the fate of whether there should be a Ukrainian state or not, or simply the Ukrainians live under German rule. Bandera did not agree with that. Bandera's faction did not agree with that. Their position was to oppose Hitler and the Nazi regime if they did not allow the creation of a Ukrainian state. During the 1930s, of course, the Nazis supported the organization of Ukrainian nationalists. The OUN carried out murders of Polish political leaders, including the interior minister, for which Bandera and several other leaders of the OUN were arrested, but they were all released after the Nazis invaded in September of 1939 and took over Western Poland, or most of Poland. From 1939 to 1941, the OUN was engaged in training and preparation for the invasion and occupation of the Soviet Union, particularly of the Ukrainian territories. I should add that the Soviet Union occupied Galicia, Bukovina, Volhynia between 1939 and 1941. So that was part of the agreement between Germany and Soviet Union. One of the founders of the OUN, besides Bandera and Melnik, who is an extraordinarily important figure in 20th century history, and you may not know him, and he was a tremendously successful Ukrainian fascist, was Mykola Lebed. Some of you may be familiar with him. He graduated from a Gestapo training school and became the chief, and from 1939 to 41, became the chief torturer of political prisoners in Krakow, murdering Poles and Jews and Russians, and whoever he came in contact. By early 1941, the OUN also had recruited tens of thousands of soldiers for military service. Several thousand of them would form two Ukrainian battalions, the Nachtigal and Roland battalions, who would be in the vanguard of the invasion of Galicia and western Ukraine. There were thousands of other OUN soldiers who were put into units known as the Nazi Hilfspolizei, or the Nazi auxiliary police. I don't think we should forget about those thousands of OUN soldiers, because their job was to help the Einsatzgruppen carry out the Holocaust in the Soviet Union. So even though they don't get much attention, I think that they're worth paying some attention to, because the Einsatzgruppen tended not to want to kill the women and children. That was left up to the Nazi Hilfspolizei, the Ukrainian auxiliary police. They also a certain number of Ukrainian OUN men were sent to serve as guards in the new death camps in Poland, Auschwitz, Sobibor, Treblinka, and so on and so on. So this OUN played an enormous role in killing millions of people in World War II. And all of the Ukrainian units were always staffed with a retinue of Ukrainian Greek Catholic clergy. This will come up in a moment. The Nachtigal Battalion captured Lviv on June 29, 1941. The next day, Bandera's deputy, Yaroslav Stetsko, announced on radio the independent state of the Ukraine without Nazi approval. He declared Bandera would be the president, Stetsko would be the prime minister. By the way, Stetsko is still hailed today as one of the great figures in Ukrainian history by the Ukrainian nationalists today. I think this is universally agreed upon by Ukrainian nationalists. And Lebed as Minister of the Interior. Good job for him. Stetsko then declared in this radio broadcast, quote, "I support the destruction of the Jews and of bringing German methods of exterminating Jewry to Ukraine. Jews, we will lay your heads at Hitler's feet," unquote. Bandera, who we are told today by the Ukrainian nationalists was just a good Ukrainian patriot, also made the following comments to the media. Quote, "Jews constitute the most faithful support of the ruling Bolshevik regime and the vanguard of Muscovite imperialism in Ukraine," True to their word, the OUN battalions killed 12,000 Jews in just July and August 1941 alone. The Nazis, of course, did not support what the OUN was doing, and so by September, Bandera, Stetsko, and Lebed were arrested and put in a very comfortable, comfortable apartments in the Sachsenhausen concentration camp. Even though it was a concentration camp, they were allowed to have telephones and communication and come and go, actually. But by 1943, the Germans began to lose the war, and that's when they changed their policies. As they were losing the war, they began to give the OUN more power. So they began, first they created the Ukrainian SS division, the 14th SS Division Galician, and then in 1944, the Nazis said, go ahead, take it, take the Ukraine, as the Nazis were retreating. And the OUN, all the OUN leaders were then released in 1944, and they established, instead of the OUN, they replaced that with something called the Supreme Ukrainian Liberation Council, which would exist until the 1990s, by the way. This is the fascist government in exile that the United States and the CIA supported all through, right up until the 1990s. And its army would be called the UPA, or the Ukrainian Insurgent Army. Their first mission, killed 10,000 Poles in Galicia to reduce the numbers. Remember, I told you, in Galicia, Poles and Jews made up the majority of the population. Well, they already took care of the Jews, now it's time to kill some Poles. In 80 separate operations on just one day, they managed to kill 10,000 Poles. Soviet forces overran the UPA, and along with 250,000 other Galician Ukrainians, Bandera fled to the American and British occupation zones in Germany. They survived, but German imperialism would no longer be their employer. Now it fell to the United States and Britain. In 1998, there's a very interesting history that was commissioned by the CIA, a secret history which was then declassified in 2006, actually, entitled, quote, Cold War Allies, the origins of CIA relationships with Ukrainian nationals, unquote. The author was Kevin Ruffner. According to this report, the Strategic Service Unit, which was the precursor, it was in between the OSS and the CIA, precursor to the CIA, began to recruit, quote, espionage agents, unquote, from among Ukrainian fascists immediately after the war ended in 1945. I think this is an important point from the DP camps. The report goes on to say that the SS, this is the CIA talking, not me. The SSU recruited them because the US, like its ally Great Britain, expected war to break out or to be created with the Soviet Union immediately. The US government wanted these agents for two purposes, according to the CIA report. One, covert operations in Soviet territory. And two, paramilitary operations in Soviet territory. Now, this comes from the CIA's own in-house history. Within a few years, also, 12,000 Ukrainian fascists would be imported to the United States despite their war crimes. So, contrary to an anti-fascist, to the image of an anti-fascist American government at the end of World War II, who would never start the Cold War, mind you, we instead see the CIA telling us in their own in-house history that yes, the Soviet image portrayed of the US as a Nazi-loving imperialist aggressor hell-bent on war with Russia was in fact the truth. This report also confirms what Soviet so-called propaganda was saying, that the USSR and the Warsaw Pact allies were on the receiving end of decades of US-sponsored covert military operations from the beginning of 1946 all the way to 1991. The United States, Britain, and Russia had signed the Moscow Agreement of 1943, promising to return war criminals to their countries where they committed their crimes. But the US and Britain violated this agreement from day one and didn't begin to get concerned about war criminals until they had to break up Yugoslavia and arrest Serbs for war crimes. According to this CIA history, by 1946, the SSU had compiled extensive records on thousands of Ukrainian fascists, and you can read these are online actually, And we're working hard to get them operational for terrorist attacks. The CIA report calls these terrorist attacks. From 1947 to 54, the CIA organized dozens of military raids by UPA soldiers into Soviet territory. Meanwhile, CIA Director Allen Dulles and NSA advisor George Kennan pushed to bring more thousands of Ukrainian fascists and other fascists into the United States for, quote, national security reasons. Chris Simpson, a historian who's written a book called Blowback, wrote something I think that's very interesting about this. He said, the U.S., with its rat lines, brought war criminals into the United States, but they didn't just disappear into the population. Instead, they established new cells in their various ethnic communities. And not just in the United States, but in all countries. And they were headed by the same men who led the murder squads and survived and spread these movements, thanks to the United States and the CIA. And they are active to this day, and they pose a threat to the world. And in the end, they poisoned and Nazified the very political cultures of the host countries too. I think that's truly blowback. That's exactly what Chris Simpson wanted to get across in that wonderful book he wrote many years ago. Until 1954, the Uniate priest Ivan Hryniuk was the recognized leader by the CIA of Ukrainian fascism, of Ukrainian nationalism, of this Supreme Ukrainian Council. And on every CIA report about Hryniuk that I've read anyway, it usually says two things. One, quote, the subject is aware he is working with the CIA, unquote. And two, quote, could be the leader of an independent Ukraine in times of war with the USSR, unquote. But at the end of 54, Hryniuk simply resigned, and from that point on until the 1990s, the man who became the global leader of the Ukrainian fascist and ultranationalist movement was Mykola Lebed. Lebed was very well protected by the CIA. He lived in a very comfortable house in Yonkers in Westchester County, maybe near Gus Hall, I don't know. He was given several CIA-funded companies. The most notable was Prolog, which was a global operation which received tens of millions of dollars at the very minimum every year from the CIA, and did all kinds of publishing, including anti-Russian, anti-Soviet publishing. What happened to Bandera and Stetsko? Bandera and Stetsko continued to have their operation based in Munich, and from 47 until 52, they were supported by MI6. What was that, MI5? MI6, right. And their operations were continually getting clobbered when they did their ops into the Soviet Union. Of course, the British didn't know at the time. It was Kim Philby who was filling in the Soviets about what was going on. After 52, West Germany's spy agency, this BND, which was still headed at that time by Gehlen, the former Nazi intelligence head, took over and financed Bandera and Stetsko's operation until 1959. This is something that's not very well known, that West Germany continued to sponsor fascist operations against the Soviet Union in the 1950s. At that point, the CIA was willing to give Bandera another try in 59, but just before he was to leave for Washington, he was captured by a KGB guy and killed. They sprayed cyanide in his face and he died. So that was the end of Bandera and Stetsko. Lebed went on to become a major figure in the Republican Party. He was also very close to the Democrats in the 1970s. He was a close friend and confidant of Zbigniew Brzezinski. He was an advisor to Zbigniew Brzezinski and a very close friend with Jimmy Carter, by the way, a Nazi. Jimmy Carter, oh, he's such a humanitarian. He's friends with Nazis. Come on. Ronald Reagan and George Bush, of course, were good friends as well. And he was financed regularly right up until 1992 when he was no longer needed. But by the time Lebed died in 1998, he was able to take great satisfaction in seeing that his success, the new generation of neo-fascist Ukrainian unit forces had taken his place. So, for example, in 1991, Lebed was able to meet with the Social National Party, which was founded by, among others, Ole Tienbuk. By the way, at that time, that party today is called Svoboda, but at that time it was called the Social National Party. What does that mean? It means National Socialists, right? Its symbols were a swastika. Today, of course, I said that the party is called Svoboda. It's dropped its Nazi symbols, but its youth organization has, in fact, continued the racist rhetoric and has spun off a whole series of paramilitary neo-Nazi organizations, including, I'm almost done.
Yeah.
Give me a minute. Okay, give me, oh, I don't need 5 minutes. I'll be done in less 5 minutes. Including the most recent, the most very well-known neo-Nazi battalion, the Azov battalion, which is therefore actually a spin-off of Svoboda's youth organization, and now is based in Mariupol and is on the front lines fighting against Novaya Russia, against the Eastern Ukrainian and Russian population there. But you know, there's such a proliferation now that have come about in the last 10 years of neo-Nazi or paramilitary groups, youth organizations, that no one, and Svoboda doesn't want. Svoboda is a very dishonest and dangerous organization. I think we can agree. The fact that it pretends to be a mainstream and anti-fascist organization is just not true, based on what we know about all of the spin-offs from this party. Now, of course, Svoboda has lost quite a bit as a result of the recent elections in late 2014. They went from having 37 delegates in the Rada, which was about 11%, to now having only 6. But the reality is that there's so many ultra-nationalist political organizations vying for support in the Ukraine today that there's no one single one that is able to become the center of this movement, which is really an adjunct to the popular face of the Poroshenko regime. So what we have, and then the rest of the last few years is, I don't even have to talk about, perhaps the other speaker will talk about. I mean, we know Victoria Nuland has mentioned, and Ambassador Piat has mentioned, that the US and CIA spent $4 billion in helping the Maidan protesters overthrow the last democratically elected president of the Ukraine, Yanukovych. What they have done is they have destroyed any possibility of any kind of workable, democratically elected, unified Ukraine. Humpty Dumpty has fallen, and he's not going to be put back together. And so now the question is, what's next? Partition seems to be the only solution. Thank you very much.
Any questions?
Maybe you could answer something. I don't know if it was true. I was kind of surprised, but I read that Makhno, who anarchists hold up as one of the great anarchists who,
Yeah.
I don't know, maybe everybody in here knows a lot more than me, but if you don't know, he was one of the anarchist leaders in the Soviet period, and eventually had a falling out with the Bolsheviks, and I guess he left and went to Paris. I think what I heard was that despite that he was supposedly a revolutionary and anarchist, he was either, and he was fighting like guerrilla war, I think, in the countryside, and they had an area called the Green Republic. I'm not sure, but it was supposed to be like an anarchist movement of I guess, mainly peasants. that he was either anti-Semitic or actually actively worked with the Ukrainian fascists. So
I mean, they didn't
is
call
there?
themselves fascist at that time, by the way. I should mention. Petlura's.
Okay. Well, I guess it would be at that time, it would be the Petlurists.
Yeah, right.
So can you clarify that? Is that
Yeah, that's
right or
basically-
wrong?
That's
or-
basically true. I mean, there were, some of Makhno's men did carry out pogroms, yes.
So he could kind of deny that he was that?
I don't,
like he
I mean,
was-
there's a lot, you know, it's been a long time since I read about, since I studied Makhno, but.
But some of his
from what-
forces did,
from-
so there's
yeah,
kind
some
of a
his
big
forces
question
did.
mark there at the
Yeah, I
very
mean,
least.
it's not a clean record, no.
Okay.
Okay, what is your name, please?
Arthur. Arthur, yeah. So I just want to respond because I read a little bit about Makhno. A lot of stuff is coming out about Makhno in Russian and Ukrainian now from the archives. And it's completely false to think that Makhno was in any way aligned with the Ukrainian liberal, bourgeoisie. They were liberals, right? They believed in a capitalist, Petlura's government wanted to create a Ukraine that's industrialized along capitalist lines and mirror basically Western Europe. They were not fascist, right? This is sort of fascism emerged. Proto-fascist, right? So it's totally false to think that Makhno himself and his anarcho-communist forces were in any way allied to the Petlura, politically, ideologically. They did commit war crimes, but it was definitely not on the level of policy, which, as you very powerfully illustrated, the Holocaust that was executed in World War II actually was preceded by a similar event.
Ukraine, there were Israeli commanders or special forces. They're taking part in the coup last year, and I feel like you're exaggerating the extent to which Ukrainian fascists are anti-Jewish. They're mostly anti-Russian and anti-communist. There were Zionists supporting the Nazis even during World War II.
It is complicated. First of all, we're not entirely sure what Israel is doing in sending over its forces into the Ukraine. On the one hand, if you read the Israeli press, you know that Israel has condemned most of the political, like Svoboda. I mean, there's lots of articles in Haaretz and elsewhere condemning the main Ukrainian nationalists on a regular basis. And yet the Israeli government itself was involved in the Maidan demonstrations, had people in there. It's not clear what they were up to, actually. I don't know. I can't say for sure. But I'm not exaggerating it. Let me point out something to you. Lebed, this Nazi, this genocidal racist, in the 1970s, he became a spokesperson for Soviet Jewry. Okay?
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, so you see, well, no, what I'm saying is that you cannot take at face value the pronouncements. Now, Svoboda, some of the leaders of Svoboda, who hail the Nazis, the Ukrainian OUN forces anyway, at the same time, they make anti-Semitic comments all the time. I mean, there was that recent episode with Mila Kunis. I don't know if you know who that is. That's some actress. She was on some TV show or something. I know she's famous somehow. Anyway, she. I don't know if you know about this episode, but she had said that she was Ukrainian. She came from the Ukraine, and then Svoboda came out with a proclamation. She's not Ukrainian. She's a Jewess. I mean, this is the sort of thing that Svoboda does engage in. I don't think I'm exaggerating. I think I'm underestimating, actually. I think what's under the surface is much worse than what we see.
That was from Ukraine, and he was telling me that once he went to a Jewish housewife to ask her for, he wanted, because he liked them, the bloody cookies. The cookies from blood. You know what this does.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Gustavo?
There is
like Ukrainian organizations, like in the Lower East Side. And I was just recently in the Midwest, and I saw, some Ukrainian organizations too. Do you know anything about
Deeply
them?
penetrated by CI-supported fascists. Deeply penetrated.
Do you know
All
how
of them.
extended they are across
Well,
the United
if-
States?
If you read these declassified CIA reports, tell you the story. I mean, the CIA financed junkets for these people like Lebed and Khryniuk, and they went from city to city, and they met with the Ukrainian populations, and as Chris Simpson said in his book, they basically planted their seed in these communities and built cells, and those cells still exist. Now, that's not to say that every Ukrainian is a Nazi, but I mean, these cells exist in the Ukrainian populations. See, what I'm trying to say is that this is a political culture that it's like a plant. It's an organism that is still in existence and is now on the verge of carrying out terrible crimes against, and has committed already terrible crimes in the Ukraine.
Martin Soma is a PhD candidate in Buffalo, and he's the chair of the Buffalo branch of U.S. Friends of Soviet People. Thank you, Martin.
The question that I've been asked to speak on has been partially answered for me with Professor Latucci's presentation. The question is, why has not the U.S. peace movement moved against the surrogate wars that the United States has been sponsoring for some several years now, for the ascendancy of the Obama administration, and particularly in the Ukraine? If the peace movement was listening to people like Professor Latouche, then of course they would have been opposing these movements. But it runs a little bit deeper, it seems, as to why Professor Latouche and others are not heard by the mainstream of the peace movement in this country. Go back to Woodrow Wilson. The peace movement in this country supported Wilson's 14 points of peace, with no understanding that this was a mere guise for aggressive actions by the United States. The peace movement appears to lack any analysis of the causes of war and is often afraid to even address the question of what are the societal causes of war. By failing to address that, they tend to ignore the levers politically that may be available to them to act. One standard that they've had of recent has been boots on the ground, with the exception of Israel. If there are no boots threatened to be on the ground, if there are no U.S. boots on the ground, then it's not a conflict that the domestic, the national U.S. peace movement need concern itself with. That, of course, is a false standard. We see what this country has been doing with the surrogate wars. Very brutal activity in Ukraine, in the Middle East, and now threatening in Latin America and Venezuela. U.S. Friends of Soviet People addressed the question of falsification of history, which also the peace movement seems to ignore. We were pleased that one resolution in the House recognized that it was the 60th Soviet Red Army that liberated Auschwitz, when the Polish ambassador was saying to the contrary that, well, it was the Ukrainian Liberation Front. Well, that Ukrainian Liberation Front, of course, Professor Latouche is laughing, was the 60th Red Army. They had liberated Ukraine and went on to liberate Auschwitz. The Senate resolution, the coordinate Senate resolution on commemoration of the liberation of Auschwitz, simply said that Allied forces had liberated Auschwitz. Well, of course, the Western Allies were nowhere near Poland, or even after the war. So it was rather misleading. So we supported the resolution in the House, which is still not passed, is sitting in committee, and that's from, the commemoration would have been in January. We addressed the issue in February, asking the Speaker to bring the issue to the floor. It's in his prerogative to do that. They left it with him. It's still not been brought to the floor. At the same time, we addressed all the major peace groups in the United States, asking them to understand that falsification of history is pretext for war, and this is something that needs to be fought. They have not joined us in seeking the passage of the House resolution that recognizes the 60th Soviet Red Army liberated Auschwitz. None have. United for Peace and Justice subsequently issued a statement on Ukraine condemning both sides of what they described as a proxy war between the United States and Russia in Ukraine. This would then devalue all the opposition in the Donbass. These are not people who are outraged by the rise of neo-Nazism in their country. They are mere pawns of Putin. They exercise an even hand here, but it's an even hand that's, in a philosophy that's abstracted from any concrete historical reality. This is why they should be listening to people like Professor Latouche, who goes into this in high detail and could resolve any questions for them. But there is this disposition within the peace movement, one, not to look at what might be causing war or what may be immediate pretext for war, in favor of certain philosophical principles. An absolutist pacifism prevails in the peace movement, going back to, well, let me not claim particular historical origins, but in a pronounced fashion, A.J. Muste, a revered leader of the peace movement yet today, was an absolute pacifist through World War II. The peace movement does not reflect on the inconsistencies of their own position in that regard. They take from Muste the view that there is no way to peace. Peace is the only way. In other words, we just need to be peaceful. This is not a rational philosophical view with regard to history. There's no way, again, I have some generalizations here that may not apply to some, of course, and certainly do not apply to some within this peace movement, but have a certain generality, do hold to some great extent, certainly among the leadership. Since there is no way to peace, then it's pointless for you and I to discuss how we can get from here, a condition of violence in society and conflicts between nations, to there, a condition we all desire, of peaceful accord among nations. This is an anti-rationalistic point of view. It becomes very difficult by people who base their conceptions on faith rather than evidence, and this applies to some who would style themselves to be on the left and not just the right. They ignore such arguments, and it is very disturbing. My locality, Western New York, Buffalo, I had been passing on reports about what's happening in Ukraine to a fairly large email list. It included the recently former chair of the Western New York Peace Center. I passed on, just simply without comment, an article about Yatsenyuk, that is Victoria Nuland's appointment to be a leader of the coup in Kiev. When he appeared on German TV to say, as we all know, World War II began with the invasion of the Ukraine by the USSR, which is a part of the USSR, and Nazi Germany, as we all know. There are such bizarre fabrications. You know, again, the one we did address to the House was against the fabrication that we're hearing in Europe, that somehow the Soviet Red Army had nothing to do with the liberation of Ukraine. These are very dangerous falsifications. A newer generation does not understand this history, as many of us here in this room, being so much older, do. Even we're hearing in Japan, there are young people saying the United States never dropped an atomic bomb on Japan. It was Joe Stalin who dropped the atomic bomb. This is really quite serious. It's really quite serious because we're not seeing the peace movement, who are people of our age too, advancing to try to correct some of these falsifications, and we really do need their support. They can draw out the numbers, and they're not. Well, anyway, I digress. My remarks are not prepared, I'm sorry. I would appeal to you for understanding of our position on this, that what we do need is a peace movement in the country who listen to able historians and shed a philosophy that keeps them from comprehending facts in favor of predispositions. Well, if there are conflicts between people, then, well, as both sides are wrong, let's have an even-handed response to this. It becomes serious. U.S. friends, United for Peace and Justice called me after they took this position and asked for my support. I said, for their peace initiative. I said, you certainly have no peace initiative. What you're doing is adding fuel to this conflict. Well, anyway, there's so much more I would care to address to you. We have been intensely following this for a year, and I am just so overwhelmed personally with what's transpiring there, and the fact that our government is promoting this kind of barbarism in the world. But of course, it doesn't just start, a few years ago. I mean, it started with the end of World War II, with the dropping of bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, while Japan was suing for peace in Moscow, with the Korean War, where the United States used bacterial warfare and concentration camps and so forth. Professor Latouche can give you more of the details on all of that sort of stuff. That was my focus, my concern, and we are still actively concerned about this. U.S. Friends of Soviet People will try to move the peace movement to a better understanding of the situation, why they should be opposing surrogate wars.
Thank you. Thank you, Martin Soma. Any questions? Yes, in the back.
Yeah, Martin Sola is your name?
Soma, S-A-W-M-A.
I'm Joe Lombardo. I'm the national co-coordinator of United National Anti-War Coalition. Our statement on Ukraine is right over here, if you'd like to read it. I think you're painting a picture too broad of a brush. I think United for Peace and Justice really does not really exist very much anymore in this country. They closed up their offices, they closed down their phones, they got rid of their staff. We just held a conference 2 weeks ago across the river in Secaucus, New Jersey. Our coalition has about 120 groups in it. I encourage U.S. Friends of Soviet People to become one of those groups. We had people from the Ukraine who were there. We had people from Odessa who brought a display of what happened at the House of Labor.
Trade unions.
Did I say?
Trade unions building.
Trade unions building. We've taken a very strong position that it's the U.S., this is a proxy war going on by the U.S., and it is related to what the U.S. wants to do in terms of surrounding Russia, just like it's doing a pivot to Asia where it wants to surround China. These are areas that are outside of its economic domination, and it wants to be able to dominate these areas. We held demonstrations in this country. In fact, we had a display of what happened in the Donbass area and in Odessa, which we brought to several cities. It was here. It didn't get to Buffalo. It did get to several cities in the United States. Yesterday, there was a demonstration in New York around the situation in Ukraine. We've held demonstrations in other cities. And we have run across some of these right-wing Ukrainians, which makes it very, very difficult to do that. It's very difficult in this political period to build demonstrations in general, and there's reasons for that which we can go in, but this is probably not the venue to do that. UNAC groups in Chicago, for instance, held some actions and were met by and physically attacked by Ukrainian community there, carrying flags which included Nazi symbols on them. And this was in Chicago in the United States. How anybody in the United States could support them in that kind of action, I think they used more diplomacy in terms of their own actions when they did that. But it's one of the reasons it makes it very difficult. And the boots on the ground is one of the reasons why you can't have a lot of demonstrations now in this country. But there are, and in upstate New York is one of the key examples. We've been protesting against the drone wars that have been going on at the Hancock base, which is in Syracuse, and a lot of people from Buffalo and Rochester, Syracuse, Albany, and those areas have joined that. So I do agree with you. I'm just saying that your brush was a little thick, because it painted me too, and I don't fall into that category. And I'd encourage you to join with us and all the folks that understand what's going on in the Ukraine, understand what's going on in other places which are very, very difficult, such as Syria or Libya or something. What the U.S. has been doing there and the proxy wars that it's doing, what's happening right now in Yemen. If you see these as important things that we need to come together and protest, I encourage you to join with UNAC and do that.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you.
David George, economist from LaSalle University. At my university, LaSalle, which has many Ukrainians, or several Ukrainians, from just after World War II, we've always been a little bit wary. And by the way, my mother's of Ukrainian background, Western Ukrainian background, so I'm not bigoted. But they clearly had some connections. After I read Stephen Cohen's work, I don't know if you're familiar with The Nation magazine, I went to a gathering at LaSalle, a panel, that was talking about events in Ukraine. It was a student who had graduated a year before who was on the panel. And I looked up the organization sponsoring him. It was the CIA front organization. And I brought that up at that meeting, and I was almost black. I was censured. It was just quite an experience. The students never talked to me again. I was kind of portrayed as a kook. And I'm not feeling sorry for myself at this stage of your life. You don't have to worry about it. But then one other side to this. I'm a Quaker, or I was a Quaker. And I brought this up at the Quaker meeting. Nothing. Really? Nothing. Now that's what's very troublesome. I went to the Soviet Union, Russia. I went to the Soviet Union in 1979. I gave talks there based on my economics work, but I brought in my politics. And I went to the Quaker house in Moscow. I did some research. They're a front group. And I'll say that because I say a front group. They're funded by, what is it, National Endowment for Democracy. Yeah. So I've had quite an experience. I know, it's like I just graduated from work and now I'm in my formative years here. But it's been very interesting and troublesome, and I really appreciate all that I heard. So thank you.
I just scratched the surface in terms of CIA front organizations for the Ukrainians. I mean, I just scratched the surface. Very widespread.
The one thing that I see, I guess it was only about a month ago, correct me if I'm wrong, the vote in Congress, House and Senate, to send lethal aid to Kiev was unanimous. The peace movement's not going to do anything about that. Cannot. Now, the only reason we didn't go further and basically say to Russia, we're calling your bluff, is because Germany and France suddenly realized, I guess, hey, they're going to conduct this exercise, in our territory. I think we were disinvited from Minsk. We weren't even there at Minsk. And so far, that's maintaining the relative ceasefire. But I have to hear more about just how good is this ceasefire and what do we have to expect about this background that we're discussing.
Thank you. What is your name, sir?
My name is Barry Kissin.
Barry. Barry also.
Allow me to answer.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
You do make a strong point, at least as it appears. But I would go back to 2013, when the U.S. Was intending, when the President of the United States was intending to put boots on the ground in Syria. And public opinion in this country, when I speak about the peace movement, it's not just the organized peace movement. It's the mass of people in this country who are opposed to war. The polls were 80 to 90% against going to war with Syria, and we didn't, of course, in this country. Now, I don't say that the popular opinion, which was also high against it in Germany, in France, and in England, was a determinative factor. It might have been some military judgments. The Syrian army could have easily brought down any ship in the Mediterranean trying to strike at them. It might have been military considerations, but I don't think we can dismiss popular opinion in this country, overwhelmingly opposed to war. Had the peace movement in this country acted when these surrogate wars began and was determined to oppose en masse activity, provide that leadership to that unorganized mass of public opinion opposed to war, it very well may be, I can only conjecture, but it does seem reasonable, that the United States would have found it extremely difficult to continue to carry on its surrogate wars. The peace movement, in that sense, has some share of responsibility, the peace movement in this country, for the fact of these wars.
Okay, but where are we in Ukraine right now, please?
Well, one thing that's going to happen is the EU has to vote on whether to maintain sanctions, and that's going to affect what goes on the ground. I mean, if Russia feels that if Russia is in a situation where these sanctions are increased and there's more pressure put on Russia and there's more pressure it's going to be more aid, also military aid to the government in Kiev. So this is going to lead to an intensification of the fighting for sure at some point. I mean, this is going to happen. Now the question is, what is Russia going to do about this? I'm not so sure.
About that, okay, this is going to be a quick war, but it's not. And what's happening is the majority of the working age population could be drafted in Ukraine. They're fleeing the country.
Yeah,
they're going into Russia, they're going into the West. There's a huge desertation rate, and that makes a big issue. So now, people like George Soros and, the big bankers are starting to rethink about it, saying, well, this is not going to be such a quick, easy takeover of the country.
When, as Jessica said, when they carried out the coup, they thought it was going to be a quick thing and that's it. But they didn't count on the resistance of people, particularly in eastern and southern Ukraine, and as far as I know, also in a more limited way in the West, right? And that you now have in Donetsk and Lugansk, you have what they call People's Republics, which have basically a kind of united front strategy. I haven't followed all the details, but I know I've looked on the internet for pictures, and you see people with these flags that say Donetsk Republic, and other people with communist flags. This is the first time now since the downfall of the Soviet Union that you have people who are in leadership of the resistance movements to, the capitalist reaction that's taken over, who are again raising the red flag. And I think that's extremely important from our view as U.S. friends of the Soviet people, because we're for the reestablishment of the Soviet Union and socialism in that area, right? And it also is very important for the fact that the U.S. can no longer get away with everything that it wants to do, that it has consequences that go directly against, what it was trying to do.
In one sense, the Soviet Union obviously Russia is not the Soviet Union, although we as friends of the Soviet people, instinctively would sort of make that association if Russia seems to be resisting, the hegemon, the global hegemon. But it seems like what's happening in the eastern Ukraine and other parts of the Ukraine is that a large number of Ukrainians, or in eastern Ukraine at least, they sort of have this yearning, for lack of other alternatives, for at the very least to go back to something that resembled, life under the Soviet Union in the 1980s, let's say, right? And there's an instinctive sort of desire to, not instinctive, but there's a desire for social stability, for basic human decency. You know, in the notion that, you know, you have a society that's, you know, you might argue it's boring from the flashy point of view of, like, you know, frolicking in Paris, but it was a society that sort of satisfied most basic needs for the average, you know, person in, let's say, 1985. Well, that's a bad year, 1980 or 1975. So that's the first tragedy, is that this is sort of like a rearguard action, a delayed popular uprising by mostly working class people to the genocidal sort of effects that followed the demise of the Soviet Union. I mean, the demographic catastrophe, right? The life expectancy dropped by 20 years across Soviet space, you know. So in that sense, that's a very tragic but kind of an inspiring moment, right? At the same time, there are people in the Donbass who are representatives of Russian reactionary, you know, forces. I mean, there are Russian fascist organizations, there are Russian Cossacks who are not communist or not socialist or not anarchist. And then this is all compounded by the fact that, you know, Putin is still covering the Lenin Mausoleum during the May 9th parades, you know? So you're dealing with sort of like a Russian government that's being pushed for its own self-survival reasons to take the Donbass uprising seriously. At the same time, it doesn't know what to do with it, because if they're successful, Putin might sort of, right? So they're sort of filling up, as I understand it, a lot of these Donbass volunteer forces are becoming formalized in a military structure that's being controlled by Moscow a lot more directly than it was 8 months ago, right? At the same time, it's true that they would not have survived without indirect Russian or direct Russian help also, right, in August or September. So it's a complicated situation. So what are some good possible outcomes out of that? And unfortunately, obviously, one outcome would be the formalization of a mass revolutionary movement, right? Which draws upon its own rich traditions, of which the Ukraine, we must not forget, was in many ways the cradle of Soviet communism, right? I mean, we can mention the famous revolutionaries that emerged from there, or worked there, or came out of there. So it's a rich sort of left tradition that's being violently deposed, but at the same time, it's also sort of constrained by Russia that's reactionary in its political system.
Political leadership in the Western Ukraine is crazy, and that everybody is going to be, it's not so much that they're looking for something of the Soviet past that is stable and safe, it's just that the alternative that they're being given is to victimize them. So when Lenin's statue is torn down in Kiev by Svoboda and all these other groups, Right Sector, etc., and destroyed, and this happens in several other places, this is seen as an attack on Russians, on Russian history, on the idea of people living together under one. And so, yes, so okay, Soviet and unified peoples living together by fascists. It speaks to something that is in their blood. They know fascism. When they smell it, when they see it, they know it. And it's a real fear. When you tear down Lenin's statue, you're not attacking Lenin. You're not attacking communism per se. You're attacking the history of the people. This is part of their history. They love that history. I mean, whatever you might say about Lenin, they love that history, and they want to, and they see that as an attack on them. So they know fascism when they see it.
Are we looking at, and if so, when are we looking at the resumption of the move on the part of the Kiev government to annihilate Russians in Eastern Russia? Is that going to start up again? And because apart from our focus on Ukraine, I have to urge focus on American neocons.
Yes.
I mean, Syria was a false flag attack. I mean, it was so perfectly obvious. Assad didn't do that chemical attack. Okay, and in fact, Russia was instrumental in avoiding what they appeared to be bound and determined to do. I mean, he actually gets Assad to agree to destroy his chemical program when Assad had nothing to do with the August 213 attack. Okay, and then the next thing you know, it looks like they're trying to put Putin in the situation of, what are you going to do about the fact that we're annihilating Russians in the Ukraine? What are you going to do about it? Look, I have to say this about these neocons. They are descendants of the folks during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Unanimous military, unanimous intelligence. We have an advantage. It is time to press it. The first thing we need to do is sink Cuba. The Kennedy boys barely hold on. Those folks haven't gone away. In fact, they're more entrenched. They're more entrenched now than they were then. They are capable of provoking nuclear war. They are capable of it. Putin has had to say he doesn't do it. He doesn't do it grandiloquently. He doesn't do it. It's same thing with that beautiful foreign minister of his, Lavrov. They're very, very calm. They know what, this is very, very calm. But it goes like this. Has the United States forgotten we're a nuclear power? I mean, 3 months ago, I'm holding on to my seat. I didn't see where else this was going.
Most people in this country, overwhelmingly most, have no realization that we have been sitting on the edge of World War III since last year ago, April. Yet much of the rest of the world does understand that the situation has been much more risky, much more dangerous than the Cuban Missile Crisis. There are nuclear weapons right up against the border of Russia. They are being threatened by it. Do we want to see these Ukrainian neo-Nazis with their fingers on U.S. nuclear weapons, as in Poland and other places? It is a factor, the ignorance about how dangerous the situation is a factor affecting the peace movement in this country that could have provided the leadership to oppose these surrogate wars. Limiting myself to that focus on the question. Yes, you are quite correct. Nuclear war is threatening. It continues to threaten a general global nuclear war from this situation in the Ukraine. Saakashvili, who wanted in his own country for crimes, is a minister without portfolio advising Poroshenko. He says that if only the United States were to give them, in the Ukraine, the necessary weapons, that they could occupy Russia. This is a very dangerous thinking. One could only hope that, as in the Cuban Missile Crisis, that maybe there are some persons of rational view who may prevail in the situation, but I seriously doubt it. I don't know how thoroughly crazy these people are.
But my view is that the U.S. policy is, if we can't control it, we'll destroy it. And so why go any further than what they're doing right now? There's a lot of other things in their toolbox that they can do, like try to prevent Russia from hosting the World Cup in 2018. I think that's clearly on the agenda right now. We want to do to Russia what we did to the Soviet Union in 1980, prevent it from having this big event. There's lots of other possible methods for. I mean, right now, I'm just sad at the destruction that's going on even now, and I think this is a success story from the American point of view. If we can't take over the entire Ukraine, then let's just push it backwards in time. Let's destabilize it further. If we destabilize Ukraine, we destabilize Russia. If we destabilize Russia, eventually we'll take it over.
What they did to Yugoslavia.
That's right.
Question about the falsification history. You really, and the anti-communism in this country, and this ties into the anti-war movement, World War I ended because of the Bolshevik Revolution.
That's right.
And it took me a long time to figure that out, even really starting to study and knowing a lot of people from different trends of Marxism who all say that we're the real Marxists, of course. But the Bolshevik Revolution and the World War I would have ended at some point. But I think World War I would have ended way into 1919 or even 1920. The Bolshevik Revolution ended it. And, you know, you've got this continuous stream of lies ever since then. Look at, and then like World War II. Read the correspondence of, I found it in books, of Stalin and Churchill. And, you know, yeah, the US and the Brits supplied a whole lot of material support to the Soviet Union. But for years, Stalin is writing one letter after another to Churchill. You keep promising that you're going to open up a second front. You keep giving us less weapons than you promise us. We've got millions of people getting fucking killed, and you keep saying we've got to wait a little bit longer. I know, we're not going to go into France where it's needed. We're going to piss around in Italy for a while. When are you going to do what you said you're going to do? So, World War II, that's another thing. It's like it ended in 1945 because of the Soviets. You know, it could have ended in 1943 if the US and the Brits were really serious. I think, or definitely 1944. Look at the anti-war movement today, and this applies to the Ukraine. We can worry all we want about the Ukraine and Syria and Yemen and so on. And the anti-war movement, here's something nobody in here has mentioned, but I think everybody knows. The anti-war movement that's collapsed has been led by liberals that support the Democratic Party. And suddenly, when Obama and Hillary were still fighting it out, suddenly the anti-war movement evaporated into smoke. And that's when UFPJ started shutting down. And we've had 7 years of war and new wars, including Syria, and you know we're at war with Ukraine. We're at war with Ukraine. There's now been a Delta Force raid into Syria. You know, we're at war with Syria. And the Yemen thing, we're throwing all this money to Saudi Arabia and all these weapons. We're at war with Yemen, and someone else is doing it for us. And you know the stuff that goes on with Israel. You know, take Lenin's policy, and if people don't like it, if they're too liberal, and by the way, all these liberals are, you know, that I can't convince to be a socialist, they've all got the thing in their head. You know what? He's a communist, and communists are bloodthirsty maniacs. And these pacifist liberals I know, you know, they all told me to vote for Obama 2 times. And they're going to vote for whoever the Democrats put up in 2016, which, by the way, because she's the most conservative Democrat and the most fanatical war hawk, is going to be Hillary Clinton. And, you know, they're going to be telling me to vote for Hillary in 2016, and, you know, nothing I say about Libya or Syria or anything else is going to convince them. You want to be an anti-war movement, you say what needs to be said, and I think Lenin said it, and you don't have to say Lenin said this because that scares them away again. You say fight your own empire. And what UNAC is doing, there still is an anti-war movement. It's small, but they're doing it, and it's a real anti-war movement. And I wanted to add one little quick thing, a personal story, which Professor Latucci just made something click in my head. When I was a kid, I had an uncle. I'm from a Slovak-American background, Western Pennsylvania. There's a lot of Slovaks, Czechs, Russians, Ukrainians out there. One of my aunts married a Ukrainian. And he said this, but he was a big talker. But now I understand why he said it and where it came from. He wanted to go sneak into the Ukraine and die with a gun in his hand, fighting those goddamn communists. And right now I know very well why he had that idea in his head, which was a fantasy for him, and I'm glad because he was a loudmouth. There's no way that he got that from anywhere other than these CIA-supported groups all over the place. And I'm not surprised at all that the Ukrainians attacked. And just by the way, on that subject, you know, what's wrong with workers' defense guards? If it's going to be like that, you know what? Just because we're in the peace movement, we've got a right to defend ourselves. You're in peace movement doesn't mean you're a pacifist necessarily. And maybe it's going to take that we're going to have defense guards, and if someone wants to come and mess with us because they're Ukrainian fascists, we're going to say, you know what? Turn around right now. You think you're going to attack us? Guess again, baby.
I was following up on what you said, that what's coming next. From the way that things are developing in Ukraine, it seems like it's not very clear timings on which side. Like the longer it prolongs, which side is more likely to win, or whatever is, how do you define win there, I don't know, but which side is going to prevail, or is there going to be, because the more time you get through this trouble, I think, there is a possibility that U.S. empire, with all its enormous power, will somehow manage to create some kind of restive atmosphere within Russia itself. And that, so it's not very clear. That's one question. If you have any more insight on that. And one more question is, who are the people? I thought you are going to say, who are the people that are fighting in Donbass area? Because like I think this gentleman said that he saw some red flags as well as some Russian nationalist, and I have no doubts that though I'm not in any organization, I don't follow it as a profession, but I am interested, so I watch it once in a while, and I have a feeling that both of these are true. But do you have any insight on like who are the people fighting there? Is it primarily motivated by the left forces, or is it just Russian nationalists? Like some people will say that it is just Russian nationalism, and I have nothing much to say about that, though.
I think there's other people who know the answer to that, but
I think I can address that.
Yeah.
When the coup occurred in February of last year, there was concern throughout southeastern Ukraine on the part of governmental leaders, and they combined to defend the Ukrainian constitution. These people are in the first instance Ukrainian nationalists, not on the right, but Ukrainian patriots. They were moved by time, by events, by barbarities that Kiev perpetrated. First of all, by the proposal that the Russian language would be criminalized, would be excluded from Ukraine, that only the Ukrainian language. So they thought, well, let us go for federalization so that issues like that are handled on a regional basis, and that we have control over it. With increasing actual barbarities, I'm sorry, I anticipated the events there, more and more people moved to separation from Ukraine as a solution. In the first instance, these same people were Ukrainian patriots trying to defend their constitution against fascist interlopers who had seized the government of Kiev.
Thank you.
If our intervention in the Ukraine was based on the fact that we want to stick it to the Russians, are we also making up a story about the Baltic states, Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia? We
What do you
claim
mean
that
making up a story?
we claim that Russia is going to invade them.
Oh, of
And
course, that's all
so
nonsense.
that's a made up story
Of
too.
course it is. Of course it is. Russia has no desire to get involved in the
Because now they're
Baltics anymore.
saber-rattling to put troops into Lithuania.
Troops into Lithuania, that's impossible.
NATO
No,
troops.
Militants
That's,
did.
NATO
oh, NATO troops. Oh, I thought you meant Russian troops.
They're already there. Part of NATO already.
NATO troops, yeah, they're part of NATO.
I know they are.
So, I mean, the idea that Russia is going to get involved in the Baltics, Russia has good relations with Finland. It has no desire to
So all this
reopen
talking
these
about
old
the
wounds with the
Lithuanians
Baltic
are so
states.
worried they're going to be invaded by Russia, that's all just a lie.
Of course it is.
Okay.
Of course it is. But what it does reflect is the desire of these Baltic states to put pressure on Russia and to try to destabilize Russia. That's what they want. That's what NATO wants.
Part of the reason that there's not a mobilization in this country is because people don't know what's going on in Ukraine. It's not covered in the news. We were looking, when we came to the Left Forum, for a panel on Ukraine. This is it. We're talking about the possibility of World War III. The left is here talking about esoteric subjects. But this is all there is on Ukraine, which is a very serious thing, because people a lot don't know. But one of the things that's happening today in the world is, you saw this with Occupy, is everybody took out their phones and they took pictures. And you got to see things that weren't on the news. And the same thing is happening in the Ukraine. There's a tremendous amount on the internet. And I would encourage people who are interested in what's going on today to look at a series called Roses Have Thorns.
That was going to be my comment, so I'll just say it. Roses Have Thorns. If you haven't seen it, it's got 16 videos by Watchdog Media, And it is up close and personal, showing you exactly what went on at the street level, starting with the Maidan. And it's very good, and it's politically very correct. Roses Have Thorns by Watchdog Media, it's all on YouTube.
And it answers a lot of these questions about really what is the Donetsk People's Republic and things like that. It's interesting to look at what they're saying. They're calling for the expropriation of all the oligarchs and for nationalization of the industry, which is pretty interesting. But it's this would be an important place to see it.
Yes, I was in Ukraine. 2013 was the 100th anniversary of Rosa Luxemburg. So there was a conference there, and the right sector threw a smoke bomb. And that was right before events started to change, and the coup happened later. But my point is that, well, Ukraine has all kinds of different political persuasions. They have Trotskyists, anarchists, Rosa Luxemburg is trade unionist, and the old Stalinists, and the right-wing fascists that were supporters of the former president Yanukovych. And so the answer to some of those questions, who are these people there? Some of them are actually quite right-wing, but then some are socialists. So we have to make a distinction between who's doing what, because the right-wing tendency is historical in that region, even though Eastern Ukraine has been historically Russian. It's only 1921 that Lenin gave it autonomy, with the criticism of Rosa Luxemburg, who said, Shevchenko is a bourgeois, poet, but yet then Khrushchev just gave a gift, from his own pocket, Crimea, which he thought it would be. They were trying to de-Stalinization process because of the famine that happened during the war. So Khrushchev gave Crimea, which was not Ukrainian at all. It was historically Ottoman, Persian, Ottoman, and then Russian and Tatar. So it had really no Ukrainian base. That's what I'm saying. Ukrainian nationalism is a new concept. So it's totally different than Baltics. They're not Russian at all. So the claim that Russia has over Ukraine is a historical and makes sense.
There are Russians in the Baltics. I mean, Estonia is like 50% Russian. Latvia is about 50%. I mean, there's a very large Russian population there. But I really have to say is, you're lucky you just got a smoke bomb. I mean, gays in Kiev or in Ukraine are under constant attack by the right. They're beaten up and brutally beaten up. I mean, very viciously beaten up. Women's rights organizations. I mean, this is really clear-cut kind of fascism that the right coming from Western Ukraine is presenting, and that's why I really think some kind of containment is necessary. I mean, the Ukrainians and Russians don't hate each other. At root, they don't hate each other. They understand that they really are brothers and sisters. It's this bizarre CIA-funded fascist movement that is posing a threat to the average person and creates the sensibility that we have to fight. We have to fight it to survive. That's just the natural reaction of people in Ukraine. And that's who really are these people in the eastern Ukraine. They're just normal people who see fascism in their face and they want to get away from it.
I used to see a lot of red flags before, and nowadays I don't see that much when I see the pictures coming out of that region. That's why I was asking you.
I'm listening to all these discussions going on, and somehow I have a feeling that there's a big gorilla sitting in the room, which people maybe assumed, but they're not stating. We are in a class struggle. This is a class struggle, both domestically and internationally. What you state going on in the Ukraine is part of the American ruling class trying to operate for its class interests. You can talk about Saudi Arabia, you can talk about the Zionists in Israel, you can talk about anything that's going on anywhere in the world is a result of the ruling class in this country struggling to maintain its world control. And we've got to start any analysis of anything, we've got to start at that central point. The American people don't know what is going on. We are living in an iron curtain country that is bound by absolute silence. My spouse and I have photographed a number of street events since, let's say, January, about 40 events. Very rarely, if anything, are any of these things pronounced in the public press, and it's not a mistake. It's intentional. There was a big nuclear demonstration last month. Over 5,000 people. You don't see it in the national press. Why? Because the ruling class controls the press. A week after that, there was something in Union Square, Black Lives Matter. At least 3,000 or 4,000 people. Not a word. Not a word. The ruling class controls everything in this country. And so whenever we're talking, whatever analysis we do, we have to begin with that central point. And they're willing to do. And don't think the National Security Agency is just looking to investigate what we're saying. They know that there's trouble in the future for them. And they know that with all this national security business, they want to know who are the radicals. Who are the ones who could possibly be leading or participating, because they're going to round us up fast as soon as they can. The ruling class in this country will have no more humanity with us than they're doing with people abroad.
Thank you.
We have to build a class struggle fight here, and the anti-war movement is part of that, the labor movement is part of that, but really win the masses to socialist ideas. I'm wondering if you could make any connections, though, because I think what's going to go down in the Ukraine is based on the U.S. and, you know, some of the empires in Europe. You know, they've got like a mouth around the western half of Russia, and, you know, yeah, they want to have fascists in Ukraine that are going to do the bidding of the U.S. and make deals. But their main goal there, and like, you know, getting the fascist in the Ukraine, to them is just like, it's like a prize. I think it's like, to them it's like it's a surprise bonus that they were able to get. But they want to use it mainly as a knife into Russia and against Putin. And, you know, so we're on the brink of World War III because of this. But, you know, lately the past few weeks I'm hearing all this stuff about South China Sea, how, you know, China is now telling the U.S., you know what, you're messing with the wrong guy. And we know there's a long-term alliance of China, Russia, Iran, you know, Syria, anybody that's got any bit of independent policy left, North Korea, whatever. Venezuela, and they're in a tough spot because they're geographically far away from these other. Can you make a connection between, and maybe there isn't necessarily, can you make a connection between what the U.S. is doing with that Ukraine thing and the new developments with all the saber rattling over the South China Sea in China? I mean, I think we're getting a real, when you have the China thing thrown in there and the Ukraine thing, we're getting really another like major step towards World War III. And
But we're not as
is that beyond what you're talking about? In this?
No, it's just that we're not as far advanced in destabilizing China, as we are with destabilizing Russia. I mean, this is barbarism what the United States is doing. The United States is promoting barbarism. That's why the media can't cover it. I mean, how can you cover? This wonderful President Obama is killing children. He's a barbarian. He's a ruthless murderer. I mean, how do you present that in the media? We haven't gotten to that point as far as China is concerned. There's too much money to be made out of China for the U.S. corporations and financial groups.
I just want to say before we leave, 4 days ago, a commander was assassinated in the Ukraine. I don't remember how do you say his name.
Moscow.
Say it?
Moscow.
Okay.
He's from Luhansk. He was a Luhansk.
Correct.
Yes, and nobody knows till this day what happened. But there was a Simon Bolivar statue. 3 days ago there was a memoriam. Some people here were there. And basically, outside of the memoriam, people were just going about their business, like they usually do in this city.
Who was he a commander for? I'm sorry.
He was for the Ghost Brigade,
Commander of the Ghost Brigade.
which was a pro-socialist formation.
Ukrainian?
Ukrainian.
Eastern.
Donbass.
Eastern Ukraine, Donbass. But the question I want to raise is that I think we should have a moment of silence for him. He was killed with his child and his wife. And his wife, and another person. And I think we should have a moment of silence now for him. I just feel strongly about that. Just a few moments. Thank you.
Alexei Moscovoy, presente!